Right, I mean, look, this isn't a huge stretch. Jon Favreau confirms The Mandalorian will match up to Disney's sequel trilogy. I mean, we knew this anyway. Like, let's be honest. Anyone that thought that they were going to wipe the slate clean or deal anything different, especially based on Mandalorian Season 2 with all the clones, I mean, come on. Really? But it's interesting nonetheless, because not only is he confirming, of course, it will match up to Disney's sequel trilogy, but he's also saying, hey, look, viewers can actually influence the continuity decisions. So this is interesting, I think, personally, as a report over on Bounding Into Comics. If you want to follow the channel, hit subscribe, ding that bell icon. I'd love to have you here more often. But Jon Favreau, the head writer and executive producer for The Mandalorian, recently claimed that The Mandalorian will indeed lead into Disney's Star Wars sequel trilogy. Like, duh, of course. It's really not a surprise. But hey, it still is interesting. I'm sure there'll be sort of referential events and then skirt past it, I would imagine. But anyway, there was a recent interview with Movie TV promoting the new season of The Mandalorian. Favreau was asked, and I quote, "You spoke about needing to have a team to keep track of all this continuity that you got going. Is it a challenge? Also, as a storyteller, knowing where this universe, this galaxy of Star Wars is like 20 to 25 years down the road in terms of the sequel trilogy and having to match up with that?" Pretty, good question, actually, from an interviewer. Favreau answered and said, yep, it's a little closer than that now. We've been on the air a little bit. So that's interesting. I do wonder what the timeline actually is, because he did reveal recently that there was a 2-year... Apparently Grogu was with Luke Skywalker for 2 years. Anyway, he says it's interesting because, you know, what's come before, and then in our time period, there's also been extended universe fiction. There's characters that have been slowly introduced in Star Wars Rebels, like Thrawn. So there's a lot of stuff that's in canon, like canon proper. But I think there's different tiers of things. And he then indicated that they look to what's canon based on audience reactions, which I like. Maybe a subtle dig almost at the sequel trilogy, a subtle dig almost at Kathleen Kennedy. And it's funny as well when it's like, oh yeah, there's canon. Remember Kathleen Kennedy's statement of, oh, there's just nothing to build from, we're just making it up. God. We really look to the fans to see what they embrace too. It's not like a science. There's definitely a conversation that's going on. Love it. Great answer. You know, the thing about this is he's obviously beholden to what's happening in Star Wars and what has happened moving forwards. He has to be, because they're never going to let him wipe it clean. But it's, you know, and he can't change that. You just can't. But the fact that he's so willing and open to say, yeah, you know what, like fan commentary does change where we go with some of this stuff. You know, what the fans embrace indicates where we choose to tell our story around that canon. That's good. That's the best you're going to get. Because they ain't going to wipe it clean. So that is the best you're going to get. That's the best possible outcome given the scenarios at play. That's pretty good. But anyway, Favreau also expressed he's looking past the sequel trilogy, despite current Disney Star Wars canon not extending past the sequel trilogy. Which is interesting. He says, and then also what happens after the sequel trilogy. Because the sequel trilogy only takes place over the course of a few years. It's a big thing on the screen, and it's very eventful. But it is a relatively brief moment in history over the course of thousands of years that Star Wars takes place. And so, what happens after it is interesting too. And he further reiterated that by saying, and I know there's some discussion, exploration going on about what happens after it, he added. So that, I would say, is actually more specifically to do with the movies that are going to be coming out. And I wonder if his team that is keeping track of the continuity within The Mandalorian and that Mandalorian Universe, maybe they'll be involved in that. Again, I'm not going to sing I'm not singing Disney's praises here at all, right? But given that he's beholden to Kathleen Kennedy and the situation at play, that is genuinely the best answer you're going to get. That he is strong-armed here. But to say, yeah, fans what they embrace, it does influence what story we tell surrounding the canon that we have to adhere to. Favreau continued to explain how he looks at Star Wars continuity, which is interesting. He says, "So I think that there are certain markers that we have. It's almost like studying ancient history, where you kind of know a few things that happen, but there's a lot of murkiness in between, and we just don't have archaeological evidence in the real world to know exactly what happened. So we kind of connect the dots." Like that. So if you look at someone like George R.R. Martin and his novels, it's really interesting to see how he treats these things, because he really does treat it like history, Favreau went on. Sometimes you have stories told from different perspectives. Sometimes you have flawed storytellers. And that's interesting. It's the unreliable narrator sort of trope, which is always an interesting one, actually. It's an interesting get out, and it does work. Sometimes you have different versions, and of course, you have different media, the books and the shows, and that interplay and that level of sophistication. And I think also having somebody like one author of it really adds to the complexity that you can have. And he would continue, and he says, "So how do we emulate that with the teams that we have both at Lucasfilm, ILM, and on the team of our shows? And how do we all work together to try to formulate that kind of consistency?" It's quite interesting. Now, this article goes on to note that the fact that they're looking past the sequel trilogy could indicate that Grogu and Din Djarin's story will continue past the events of the sequel trilogy, and thus they would be dealing with the galaxy once again finding itself in the middle of chaos, with the New Republic's core planets wiped out by the First Order, and the First Order's quick rise to dominance throughout the galaxy, the usurpation of the First Order by Darth Sidious, and then Sidious's death and destruction by members of the Resistance. I would say that's almost a certainty. And there's Coruscant in in the trailer of the new season of Mandalorian. So, yeah. It's possible that the Mandalorians could fill the power vacuum left by the destruction of the New Republic. It's an interesting sort of theory there. I quite like this stuff. I really do. Actually, I think again, I'm not sitting here singing their praises or anything like that. But from a discussion perspective, and in terms of what he personally has to deal with, this is the best situation you're going to get given the current scenario. Unless he's given full control of Star Wars. But even then, I don't think he'd wipe it clean. He's building towards it. Doesn't mean he has to tell that story. It means he can just skirt around it, which I think works quite well. And it's always good, of all the people, I would say he's probably the most sincere when he says anything about fans. I don't believe Dave Filoni, and I don't believe Kathleen Kennedy. But let me know what you guys think down below. Cheers, guys. Take care.